As the global leader in choline, Balchem has spent more than 50 years perfecting the art and science of choline chloride production. The new Puricol line delivers the highest standards of quality, produced in state-of-the-art manufacturing facilities, and backed by the strictest process controls for a level of purity, safety, and consistency you can't find anywhere else. Turn to Puricol choline chloride from Balchem for an unmatched level of quality you can trust. Visit balchemanh.com to learn more.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Real Science Lecture Series. My name is Scott Sorrell, Director of Global Marketing for Balchem. Coccidiosis is one of the most prevalent diseases affecting the U.S. broiler industry. With decreased performance, morbidity, and mortality, the estimated global impact is up to $300 million. For today's Real Science webinar, we welcome Dr. T.J. Gaydos from Gaydos Technical Services. As the poultry industry moves toward reduced use of antibiotics, we need to look for ways to manage disease and reduce the economic impact. I would now like to introduce Dr. T.J. Gaydos. Dr. Gaydos grew up in Ohio and is now the owner of Gaydos Technical Services based in Dallas, Texas. He received his Bachelor of Science degree from Kent State University and his DVM from the Ohio State University. He earned a master's in avian medicine from the University of Georgia and is a diplomat of the American College of Poultry Veterinarians. TJ has spent his veterinary career working to improve intestinal health, animal welfare, production efficiency, and to reduce zoonotic diseases. He has worked extensively with coccidiosis, intestinal health, probiotics and prebiotics, and other non-antimicrobial feed additives, and helped shape the research program for several commercial companies. Dr. Gaydos uses his experience, knowledge, and relationships to help others in the poultry industry. TJ, the floor is now yours.
Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, today we're going to be talking about coccidiosis and its effects and how we can mitigate those effects in antibiotic-free production system. Just giving an outline of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to start the presentation talking about coccidiosis in chickens and then very briefly in turkeys, and then discuss some of the solutions that are available for those diseases. And then we're going to jump into eneritis and talk about eneritis and how it's tied to coccidiosis. We're going to, the same order, we're going to talk about chickens and then turkeys. And then we're going to talk about solutions for eneritis. And then we're going to open the floor up for some questions. To start off with, we're going to talk about what is coccidiosis in general. Coccidiosis is a protozoal disease caused by different species from the genus Eimeria. Coccidiosis species are very species specific, meaning that only coccidiosis for chickens can affect chickens and turkeys can affect turkeys. There are some exceptions to that, but not in the commercial production. Coccidiosis in chickens and turkeys is an intestinal disease. In ducks and geese, it's a kidney disease, but we're going to be focusing on just chickens and turkeys and the intestinal portion of coccidiosis. Okay. Why is coccidiosis such a important issue for poultry production? And the short answer is that coccidiosis lives in the intestine, and we need the intestines. The animals need the intestines to absorb nutrients. And as these parasites replicate in the intestinal wall, they cause damage, reducing the absorption efficiency of these animals. Of course, coccidiosis can also cause mortality, depending on the species and how severe the infection is. And understanding the coccidiosis life cycle is the most important part of understanding how to best manage it in a system. And in general, so this life cycle is a general life cycle for all the coccidiosis species that live in the intestine. There are some minor differences between the species, but it's not practically relevant. To start with, the oocyst comes out of the back end of a chicken or a turkey on day one. So a chicken ingests an oocyst and it gets into the gut, and on day one, it starts replicating. And the life cycle inside the chicken takes roughly 6 days, and then the chicken or turkey releases an oocyst in its feces, and the oocyst begins its outside of the chicken part of the life cycle. That part of the life cycle is called sporulation, and that's the part of the life cycle that we can control as poultry producers. Okay? When the chicken or turkey releases an oocyst, poops out an oocyst, that oocyst is not infective, and it is needs to be sporulated to become infective to continue the life cycle on to continue that cycle. Sporulating oocysts requires 3 different things. It requires heat, oxygen, and moisture. Chicken houses are plenty warm, and they have plenty of oxygen in them. And so the major thing that we can control to adjust the rate of sporulation and the amount of oocysts that sporulate is litter moisture. And we'll talk about that more later. So of this whole life cycle, the only thing that we can control is the sporulation process, and because the rest of the process that's inside the chicken is controlled by biology, with the exception, of course, that's where we can use either chemicals, ionophores, or natural products to modify that life cycle or reduce the efficiency of the replication of those oocysts inside the bird itself. This is a picture of an unsporulated oocyst, just to give you an idea of who we're talking about during this presentation. And then this is a picture of the sporulated oocyst. So you can see that they're definitely different, have a definitely different appearance, and very much different in their biology. Okay, so on to the specific portion of chicken coccidiosis. Okay. When we're talking about broiler production, there are 3 species that are most relevant for broiler production, and they're Eimeria acervulina, Eimeria maxima, and Eimeria tenella. Also, Eimeria mitis is of a concern as well. So start at the top of the intestine in the duodenum. That's where you have Eimeria acervulina. It's a superficial invader, meaning that it does not replicate deep inside the intestinal tissue. So it's less impactful for performance and less impactful for mortality. Can acervulina cause mortality in chickens? It's possible, but the infection would have to be extremely severe. It has characteristic lesions, and it causes these white spots or stripes inside the duodenum itself. And you can see them on the inside. Sometimes you can see them on the outside of the intestine. And those white lesions are actually clumps of the oocyst inside the tissue. Acervulina is extremely prolific. For each sporulated oocyst that a chicken ingests, it can produce up to 1 million oocysts on the back end coming out of the bird. The next species is Eimeria maxima. It preferentially lives in the midgut, in the middle of the intestine, around the yolk stalk or Meckel's diverticulum. Eimeria max is a problem because it one stage of its life cycle lives very deep in the intestine, in the mucosa, right at the edge of the serosa. So during that life cycle, when those oocysts are released, it causes damage to the intestine, and so much that it can even cause intestinal hemorrhage. The lesions are relatively nonspecific. If you see the picture below, it's just mucus in the intestine. The intestine itself has an appearance like it's upset. So because of that non-specific type of lesion, we typically look at these, we do intestinal scrapings and look at the intestinal contents under the microscope to confirm that the intestinal issue is Eimeria maxima. Again, because this species of coccidiosis damages the intestine so much, even a very mild case of Eimeria maxima infection can significantly steal or rob performance. Another species of note for chickens is Eimeria tenella. And Eimeria tenella completes its life cycle in the ceca, also a deep invader of tissues. So during that life cycle, again, Eimeria tenella, when those oocysts are released, it can create intestinal hemorrhage, as you can see in these pictures here. Ceca full of blood. This is a really severe case. Of course, you can have much more mild cases where there's just thickening of that intestinal wall, of that cecal wall. The cecal appearance should be thin. You should be able to see through it. It should be completely transparent. But in acute infection, you'll see blood in these intestines or bloody droppings on the floor. In a past infection, you can see cecal cores, which is a more yellow material filling that ceca, which is evidence of past Eimeria infection as well. Okay. So if you're talking about longer lived birds, like layers, tail leg layers, or broiler breeders, there's two more species of Eimeria that are important. It's Eimeria necatrix and Eimeria brunetti. These two species are much more common in longer lived birds because they're less prolific and they need some of the same space as the first three. So they're essentially just outcompeted in these shorter lived birds. And once the first set of coccidiosis cycles, the Acervillina maxima and tenella, that opens the environment for these two other species to replicate in the bird. Eimeria necatrix is a significant cause of, can be a significant cause of mortality in longer lived birds. It causes its damage in the midgut, but it has a portion of its life cycle in the ceca as well. It's has a pretty characteristic lesion, which we call salt and pepper. You can see in this photo here, there on the intestine, there's white dots and sort of reddish to black dots. Those white dots are the conglomerations of the parasite, and the reddish to purple dots are damage from when the life cycle leaves when the parasite leaves the intestine as a part of its life cycle. You can also see that the intestine is extremely ballooned, and if you were to touch it, it would be filled with gas, and the intestinal wall itself will be pretty flaccid. Eimeria necatrix can cause severe bumps in mortality. The other species is Eimeria brunetti. It also causes mortality. To me, it has a similar appearance to the contents have a similar appearance to Eimeria maxima, sort of a more non-specific lesion. And what the difference is, the lesions are going to be much more in the lower gut as opposed to the midgut. And you can also get just a little bit of lesions in the ceca, but that's a little bit less common. So you're looking for a sort of non-specific mucus type lesion in the lower gut as opposed to the midgut, and it's going to typically be in an older age bird past 6 weeks of age. That's the easiest way to differentiate it from Eimeria maxima. This is an overview of all of the species that we talked about and a few extras. I was giving you an idea of where they live in the intestine. Again, you have Acervillina living in the front part, the proximal part of the intestine, and Eimeria brunetti living down near the bottom in the rectum and colon and in the lower gut. You have Eimeria maxima living in the middle. Mitis also living more towards the middle. Necatrix causing its damage in the middle of the intestine but replicating in the ceca. You've got Eimeria praecox, which we didn't talk about, and it tends to be up more towards the proximal section in the duodenum as well. It tends to be less severe as well. And finally, we have Eimeria tenella, which lives in the ceca and also causes damage. So switching the discussion to turkey coccidiosis. Turkey coccidiosis are a little bit more difficult to discuss, and because the lesions are much more nonspecific. And you can see that the area that these oocysts tend to live in the intestine overlap quite a bit. And the size of these oocysts are very similar. There's a few exceptions to that, with Eimeria adenoides, looking very much like Eimeria tenella in a chicken, living in the ceca, and it can cause lesions, significant lesions. And you have Eimeria meleagritis living in the midgut, also causing potentially some serious lesions. But in general, the coccidiosis in turkeys is more of a performance robbing situation, and it is much less linked to mortality than we see in chickens. So we're going to talk about solutions to coccidiosis, and the most important solution to coccidiosis is management. Like we talked about in the beginning, coccidiosis vaccines or coccidiosis vaccines are comprised of live oocysts. And so they are vaccines, but they're much more, you can think about them much more like controlled exposure. These oocysts have been selected for lower virulence. Some of the vaccines on the market are attenuated. The vaccines aren't attenuated in a normal way, like we think about attenuating a respiratory vaccine or a viral vaccine, where we're passing it serially and trying to select for less virulent serotypes. What happens is that the making of attenuated vaccines, they selected for precocious strains, so they select oocysts coming out of the chickens earlier and earlier. And as you select for those more precocious strains, what you're doing is reducing the life cycle that is happening, the asexual life cycle happening inside the intestine. And because of that, pulling out those extra life cycles, you reduce their ability to replicate, and you're reducing the amount of replications in the tissue, making them less pathogenic, causing less lesions. But at the same time, those asexual replications are what give you the numbers coming out of the chicken. So it's more difficult for the attenuated vaccines to compete with the wild types. So when you're using a coccidiosis vaccine to manage clinical coccidiosis, you're looking for uniform and carefully managed cycling. So you don't want too much cycling, but you want just enough to create immunity. So there's 4 major parts to management of coccidiosis. 3 parts are really in our control. So that's in the hatchery, on the farm, and our feed. And 1 part is the biology of the Eimeria, which essentially we can't manipulate. So when we're talking about managing coccidiosis in the hatchery, good quality chicks start better. We want, if we're using a vaccine, we need to make sure the vaccine is applied evenly, mixed appropriately, stored appropriately, just like any vaccine. But chick quality plays a large part, because those chicks need to preen each other and get the oocysts off of the other chicks during the vaccination process. The next part of the discussion is about farm management. And the most important thing is doing the basics correctly. So managing your feed, water, light, litter, heat, and ventilation on your farm. Feed and water are extremely important. If the birds need to have really excellent access to feed. If they have excellent access to feed, they're more likely to eat feed and less likely to pick at litter. Litter is where those oocysts from the previous flock are going to be living. So you're reducing the amount of oocyst uptake by having adequate access to feed. Again, litter management is extremely important. Litter management, we're managing that moisture content of the litter to manage the speed in which those oocysts reproduce and the percentage of oocysts that reproduce. So we're talking about brooding in management. One of the important things is chick distribution. So we're giving these birds coccidiosis vaccine, which is live oocysts, and we're expecting those oocysts to replicate inside the chick and then be deposited back into the litter. And we want those oocysts to be redeposited evenly across the house. If the chickens are uncomfortable and are concentrated in a certain area, they're much less likely to distribute the oocysts evenly. Also, comfortable temperatures, just good brooding techniques make for more resilient chicks and make them more comfortable, and they just generally do better. Chicks that are more comfortable are more likely to move about the house and eat, and less likely to be picking litter, etc. Again, reducing drafts and feed availability is really important. So managing coccidiosis cycling, you're looking for a target litter moisture of 25%. That's the ideal litter moisture for coccidiosis to cycle enough to continue the life cycle, but not so moist that the sporulation gets out of control and causes excessive coccidiosis cycling. So if you've got really wet litter, you're going to have an absolute ton of oocysts, and that will cause, you're more likely to have clinical coccidiosis or necrotic enteritis leading from that. Managing the density of your birds is really important. So in broilers, typically on a coccidiosis vaccine, you're going to be brooding those birds in half house and keeping them in half house for roughly 9 to 11 days. And then you're going to be turning them out to full house. The reason for that is the coccidiosis life cycle and when those oocysts are shedding in their pattern. So again, I mentioned that there's two portions to the life cycle, and it's again here again because it's really important. When those oocysts leave the chicken, they're not infectious. We have to make them infectious by sporulating them in the litter, and regulating that sporulation rate is one of the major things that we can do to manage coccidiosis. Okay. So this is a schematic of a way to think about how we're managing coccidiosis vaccine. So we've got these little chicks living in half house during the brood period. And if the animation is not working here. So so if you put these coccidia in at half house during the management, so if they spend 2 life cycles over here, you can imagine them dumping down 2 series of oocysts, and remember that they're growing exponentially. So just think about Acervulina because it's the easiest one to think about. 1 oocyst in makes 1 million out. So if you have 1 life cycle dumping over there, you have 1 million oocysts on that side. If you allow those chickens to stay in half house for 2 life cycles or 14 days, you get 1 million times 1 million out for every chick that's in there. And so that's why we want these chickens to dump their oocysts at 14 days in the whole house. So on the brood side, on the first half, you have 1 set of 1 million oocysts, and then they spread out, and you have 1 million times 1 million across the whole house. So because the numbers are so large in that second cycle, it doesn't create disuniformity, because the first life cycle that happens in the brood side of the house is completely overwhelmed by the second cycle. Okay? So you always need birds to be turned out before 14 days. It will be almost impossible to keep chickens on that side of the house and in half house for more than 11 days, because you start to lose the amount of moisture. You start to lose the litter. There's just far too much moisture. So right around 11 days, if you can go that long, is perfect. 9 days oftentimes is a lot more realistic based on the density of birds that we grow in commercial production. So managing broiler brooder pullets is a little bit of a different discussion. These birds are at much lower density in the way they're grown, and the litter is much drier. So when you're managing coccidiosis in using vaccine in pullets, one of the keys to success is to quarter house brood those birds for the first life cycle. So keep them in the one quarter of the house for 7 days, and then turn them out to either half house, or some people keep them in quarter house for 5 days and then turn them into a third house for another day or two, and then they're turned out to the half house at around 7 days, and then they're going to spend roughly 28 days, 25 to 28 days in that half house before they're turned out to the full house. And these models are two different ways that you can do your quarter house brooding. The photo on the left shows a fence keeping the birds on the left side, which can be a lot of work, putting that fence down. So if you're getting pushback from your producers on that, it's not quite as good, but you can keep them on one half of the house by controlling lighting. And that's the photo to the right. You can see that rope lights are put down on the water lines, and those were used for lighting in the house, but to keep the birds on that side. And you can see the lights on the top are only lit on one quarter of the house, and the other rows of lights are not turned on. And the chickens don't like to be in the dark, so the chickens stayed over on that side, and they do it pretty well. Again, a fence is the best option for sure. So the third part of managing coccidiosis that's under our control is managing feed. So of course, high quality nutrition is important in antibiotic-free production, or any production, of course. Feed mill, you're looking at pellet and mash quality, uniform inclusion of products, whether it's non-antimicrobial solutions, chemicals, or ionophores, and then correct feed delivery. We want to make sure the right feed is getting to the right farms. And think about feed distribution and handling. Are you having feed separation? In pullets, are all of your houses getting, or all of your pans getting the same amount of feed, etc. There are a pile of approved FDA approved products for poultry. Some of these are antibiotics and some of them are chemicals. You can see that a lot of these products are really old. First invented in 1948, and the most recent one was invented in 1999. The odds of the poultry industry getting new products for controlling coccidiosis is pretty slim, because of the cost of bringing these products to market. So as we move further into the future, we're going to be much more reliant on vaccines and natural solutions to manage these, not including the push of consumers to have products that are raised without antibiotics. So irrespective of that, we're going to be forced more and more to rely on vaccines. Okay. So as we know, the market is full of feed and water additives for intestinal health. So we've got probiotics and prebiotics, there's fermented products, there's plant extracts, we've got enzymes, organic minerals, organic acids, plenty of others. And then to create even more products, we've got blends of these different products. When I'm thinking about specifically coccidiosis, I think the vast majority of products that are going to be natural products that are helpful for coccidiosis fall into that plant extract category. Then we're looking at plant extracts. There's two different groups in my mind, and one of them is just these the plant extracts that are mostly from the spice category, like cinnamaldehyde, capsaicin, eugenol, from cloves, thymol to some extent as well. And a lot of people are hesitant to use these products because they're just, they're plant extracts and people don't think they work and don't give them a chance just because we're not thinking about them being antibiotics. And I'm not saying that all of them work, and there's definitely differences between these products. But the point of this slide is just to stop and think about some of the other products that we use and we are well known and accept to work. Like aspirin, for example, that no one's going to argue that aspirin is not an effective drug. And of course, it's refined and different in today's world, but it's an extract of the willow tree. Another example is codeine. I don't think that anyone would argue that codeine doesn't have biologic function, and it's a refined extract from the poppy plant. Okay, so if you looked at the structure of codeine and aspirin, you see the rings and the OH groups. And if you look at all these phytomolecules, cinnamaldehyde, capsaicin, etc., they have similar structures. So obviously they're not the same, but there is potential that these products could have biologic effect, and there is evidence in the literature that shows that they do. The other major category of products that have a significant impact on coccidiosis and the coccidiosis life cycle are saponins. Yep. Saponins are extracts from plants. Typically used are the yucca plant and the kiaa plant. And saponins are chemical compounds that have soap-like properties. And saponins, they disrupt the membrane of the coccidiosis oocyst, and they actually there's evidence in the literature that shows that saponins can reduce oocyst shedding and reduce oocyst output when fed to chickens specifically, but turkeys as well. So saponins, there's direct evidence for saponins and their ability to modify the life cycle of coccidiosis. There's also evidence that tannins can have an effect, direct effect on coccidiosis reproduction as well. So all of the non-antimicrobial feed additives, with the exception of the chemicals, amprolium, zoline, etc., in my opinion, is that they're all in the plant extract category. Okay. So talking about eneritis, there's two basic categories of eneritis. You got other than parasitic, which we talked about already. You've got bacterial and viral eneritis. Bacterial eneritis falls into two categories: necrotic eneritis or dysbacteriosis. And you have viral eneritis, which is reovirus is a part of that. Runding and stunting syndrome. There's undefined viral eneritis, small viruses. And then in turkeys, we have hemorrhagic eneritis, which is another separate viral disease. Okay. So necrotic eneritis typically happens in the midgut of chickens. And you can see that photo on the bottom, and the photo on the left is a classic photo of necrotic eneritis. The photo on the top is necrotic eneritis in the duodenum. So it can happen in the duodenum. It just tends to be a little bit less common. So you need three things to create necrotic eneritis. You need damage to the intestinal wall, you need disruption of the intestinal microflora, and you need a toxin-producing Clostridium perfringens. And if you don't have one of those three things, the severity of your necrotic enteritis is going to be reduced significantly. So we're going to be focusing on, when you're focusing on managing necrotic enteritis, you need to be focusing on reducing one of those three things. And typically we'll be focusing on two of them. One is managing the coccidiosis, but we need to remember that there's other things that can damage the intestinal mucosal integrity. Mycotoxins, poor feed quality, fat or rancid fat or rancid feed, other intestinal parasites like worms. So those can all cause damage that can open the door for this Clostridium to wreak its havoc. So we're thinking about viral enteritis. The appearance is much different. So you're going to have thin, watery intestines, thin intestines with watery contents. You can see that the Sika there has bubbles in it from dysbacteriosis, so some strange fermentation happening in there. Mortality from viral enteritis tends to be pretty negligible. It can be severe, but normally it's negligible. The real problem with viral enteritis, as you can see on the left, is the difference in uniformity. So these are birds that are almost process age, and you can see this difference in breast size between birds that were affected and not affected. Hemorrhagic enteritis. This is specifically a turkey disease caused by an adenovirus. It's controlled by vaccination, and it's immunosuppressive. So in addition to it causing enteritis, the virus causing enteritis and damaging the intestine, which can range from moderate to severe, including mortality. But even if you don't have a mortality event, the adenovirus that's causing this disease is immune suppressive, and so you can get the secondary effects of immune suppression later in life. Again, the market is absolutely full of feed additives and water additives. It's the same list as I showed before: the probiotics, prebiotics, the fermented products, and the plant extracts. We've got enzymes and organic minerals and acids, and then the blends of these products. And this is the area where I think that the vast majority of these products have their effect in general intestinal health and much less impact on specifically on coccidiosis. The probiotics and prebiotics are going to be really useful for managing that intestinal microflora and managing your dysbiosis, cutting one of the corners off the triangle of coccidiosis, or excuse me, of necrotic enteritis. You got your plant extracts, which some of them are directly antimicrobial, so they can impact the Clostridium directly. You've got other plant extracts that are antiparasitic or have antiparasitic effects. You have enzymes that are in the diet that can be reducing the excess nutrients, and reducing those excess nutrients in the diet can help to manage your intestinal microflora more appropriately. Again, we've got the organic acids. One, acidification of the gut can be important, but the acid itself can be used by different bacteria. The lactate part of the butyric part specifically can be useful for managing intestinal health. And again, you've got different blends of these products that can help as well. Okay. So that brings up the question: what is the correct feed additive to use in your system? There's a few things that I think about when I'm selecting a feed additive for a system. I'm thinking about it being consistently produced. I'd like it to be evidence-based. I'd like to have a strong base of evidence produced from different sources, whether university or the company itself. The additive needs to be specific for the problem. If I have a coccidiosis problem, I'm probably not going to be using a probiotic to address that. I might use the probiotic to help manage the secondary effects of coccidiosis, but it's not going to be helping directly with the coccidiosis. Again, you also need to think about risk versus your return on investment. Products that are $10 a ton, $10 a treated ton, are they going to provide the return on investment that you need to make it worth your while to feed them? And that's a question for each individual system and how bad your problem is. Okay. So to me, the most important thing about managing coccidiosis and eneritis is good management. 95% of managing intestinal health in poultry is good management. The other 5% is feed and water additives. Nothing will replace good chick starts, good chick quality, good pullet management, good breeder management. But our efforts can be multiplied by using some of these other products that are in the marketplace. And with that, we'll open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you, TJ. Before we get started answering questions, we'd like to share a brief video, and then we'll be right back to answer the questions submitted during today's presentation.
Organic trace minerals come in many types and formulations, leading to confusion about chemistry, terminology, and methodologies. With Balchem's Quiche line of chelated minerals, we provide superior performance and exceptional value by keeping it simple. Binding minerals to the highest quality plant protein-derived amino acids and peptides in our world-class production facilities, using a true chelation process pioneered by Balchem and trusted in both the human and animal arenas for nearly 60 years. The Quiche line delivers proven and consistent bioavailability to maximize performance, and a no-frills pricing approach for greater profitability. Visit balchemanh.com to see how Quiche chelated minerals are your link to superior performance and exceptional value.
As a reminder, you can still submit questions through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. TJ, just curious, when you get called onto a poultry operation, they've got some issues. What are some of the key factors that dictate the intervention that you design for that particular producer?
Yeah, so that's a great question. One of the things that's important is the relationships that that producer has with their suppliers. So, I like to work with people that I like to work with. It sounds silly, but that's a significant part of the process is the trust with a supplier. Because there are so many products in the market, uh, you've got to have a filter, and one of those filters is trusting the supplier to provide you with data that you think is real, and um, and a supplier that's willing to be a true partner in your process. So that's the first part. The second part is what is identifying the problem. Do we have a coccidiosis problem that's causing our necrotic enteritis, for example, or do we have a Clostridium problem? So go down that diagnostic pathway, and then from there, that's going to help decide the product that we use, and of course, what's already being used in the diet. If you're already using a probiotic and a prebiotic, and you're still having a problem, adding another probiotic is probably not the solution, right? So you need to look at different technologies.
Okay. So, as you're designing the programs, let's say that the producer has a cocci problem. What are typically some of the first things that you reach for off the shelf in terms of what ingredients will typically be in TJ's formula?
Yeah, so if I'm looking at a coccidiosis problem, specifically in chickens, the first thing I'm going to be checking out is the management. So I want to make sure that they're turning out like they say they're turning out, that the number of birds per square foot or pounds per square foot is appropriate, their brooding is tight and appropriate, that everything is running the way it should be. So we rule out management things first. The next thing I'm going to be looking at is right off the shelf as a saponin. I've personally had a lot of success with them in mitigating coccidiosis cycling.
You mentioned saponins and how they disrupt the coating, I guess it was. So why don't we use other soaps, be it calcium soaps, sodium soaps? Why are we looking for plant extracts?
We're using plant extracts because they're GRAS certified, generally recognized as safe. So you can put them in a diet without extra testing. Why specifically we're not using other soaps? That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, very well. I got a question here from Eliza. She'd like to know, is the 25% litter moisture also ideal for turkeys?
Yes, that's related to the biology of the coccidiosis.
Okay.
Of the coccidia, excuse me.
Got a question here. Do feed additives used as preventatives do they have negative effects on cocci vaccine programs, and can they be used together?
Yes, they can be used together. Um, I've not seen specifically any negative effects unless where you're at is very dry. Uh, if you're growing chickens in the desert, or for example, you're growing chickens in the northern United States where you have to heat a lot, and your litter is really, really dry, I tend not to put those products in early. Like I'll leave them out of the starter to allow the coccidia to cycle to get one or two good cycles, and then I'll put them in typically in the grower and finisher to help reduce that peak cycling. But while they do disrupt coccidiosis cycling, they don't disrupt it as much as a chemical. So all things being equal, they're not going to damage your cycling, and they can be used together. Like I use them together in almost every program that I've got with coccidiosis vaccine.
All right, thank you. Anita wants to know, can we monitor oocytes in the litter, and how do we correctly interpret the results? Number of
Yes,
oocytes?
yes, absolutely. You can do oocyst litter counts. The best way to monitor those is you need to collect several different fresh poops from around the house in a different area, mix them up in a bag, because you're not looking at what's happening in one individual bird. You're trying to see what's happening inside the system. So you want a representative sample. And then you're going to send those out to a lab to do counting, and you're going to want to send them on a regular basis from one house on one farm. Depending on the kind of granularity that you're looking for in your data, every 4 days, starting at, let's say, 14 days of age and going to where you think your problem is, 28 or 32 days. And what you're going to see out of that is a curve of oocyst production. And will give you a baseline. And then from there, you can use that data internally to see if you're shifting that cycling pattern one way or the other. There's no specific standard for how many oocysts you should find in the litter. It's related to your individual system, and if you're having a problem, you'll know if you have X number of oocysts and you're having a problem, you know that that's too many oocysts.
Okay. Is there a preferred food source for protozoa, and are there any nutritional interventions for controlling their populations?
No, the coccidiosis are living inside in the intestine. Are there any nutrients in the diet that are helping the coccidia? I don't believe so. The exception is, amprolium is a thiamine analog, and so we can use amprolium to disrupt their life cycle. Of course, that's a chemical coccidiostat. As far as like formulation, management of coccidiosis, I'm not aware of anything, but that's not saying it's not out there.
Right. Okay. Are there cocci vaccines for less common species of poultry like quail and pheasants?
There are none that I'm aware of that are commercially produced.
Okay. Pavel is asking, interested in your opinion about Brutini. Can Brutini be detected at 38 to 40 days of age in commercial broilers? And can Brutini transfer from vaccinated parents to commercial flocks?
Theoretically, it could be, you could get it in commercial broilers. Absolutely possible. It would be very uncommon. And then can it be transferred from parents to commercial flocks? It's a good question. Yes, it could be transmitted. Of course, not traditionally vertically transmitted, but if you had eggs that were contaminated, they could get into the hatchery, and you could theoretically transmit it. Yes.
Okay. Are there other protozoa species other than the pathogenic ones that create cocci? Um, are there other ones that are important for maintaining a healthy microbiota?
Yes, there are other there are piles of other protozoa that live in intestines, especially there's a few in turkeys um, that are pretty important that cause disease, can cause disease like coccidiosis. Um, are there other protozoa in the intestines? I'm sure there are. Just like any species, we've got the intestinal microflora is a really complex environment. We tend to only think about pathogens in sort of a limited view. Um, so this is not the question that you asked, but uh, viruses. We think about viruses only that cause disease. The bacteria that are in the intestines, they have their own viruses. With hundreds to thousands of viruses that are living all the time in our intestines, and they don't cause disease, so we don't think about them. We don't have names for them. So the answer, sort of a roundabout answer, is absolutely. There's the intestinal microflora is a complicated thing, and we're learning more about it every day.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Alex would like to know, have you looked at the microbiome and ways to measure a good microbiome markers that would prevent coccidiosis and necrotic enteritis and be detectable?
That's a really good question. It's almost a whole nother discussion.
Mm,
Uh, Microbiome is complicated, and this is kind of a cop-out answer, but there's some really interesting research on the human side because there's a ton more money, obviously, in human research than in animal research. And there's some good data that shows that, like, right after breakfast, my intestinal microflora is more similar to Scott's intestinal microflora than my intestinal microflora is to my own intestinal microflora before breakfast. So a lot of it is feeding related, and and how you're taking the samples, where you get the sample from. Is it a mucosal scraping? Is it a washed sample? Is it luminal microbiome? So there's lots of variation in it, and we're finding, as scientists, not me specifically, but the more you look, the more complicated it becomes. And so the answer, I think, in short, is I don't think we really know the answer to your question.
okay. Alex would also like to know, are Cryptosporidia a problem
Mhm.
in poultry?
Cryptosporidium,
Sporidium, yeah.
yes, they can be a problem in poultry. Um, Not nearly like they are in cattle, for example, or in people, but they theoretically can be in poultry, yes. But do I think about them on a daily basis or even a monthly basis? No.
Okay. Next question is, how long can you use one vaccine without creating Emeria resistance?
Yeah, so when you're using coccidiosis vaccines, it's not like other vaccines, it's controlled exposure. So you're not creating Amelia resistance because you're putting non-resistant oocysts back into the system all the time. And by resistance, I mean resistance to the anticoccidial drugs. So theoretically, you can use coccidiosis vaccines forever. They tend to be a little bit more difficult to manage in the wintertime when it's more difficult to manage litter moisture. But you can use them year round and forever, theoretically.
Okay. Do some of the additives that we've talked about negatively interact with others? And do you have some examples?
Um, I'm sure that there are things that negatively interact with each other. Most likely, the most common thing is just too much cost. So if you have, you know, two or three different probiotics in there, they're not going to necessarily negatively interact with each other, but you just can't afford the ROI on that. As far as two things that I wouldn't use together, I don't have any experience with true negative interactions. But you want to think about things like like saponins and tannins that directly impact your coccidiosis cycling. So theoretically, you could negatively impact immunity to coccidiosis by doing too good of a job at shutting down your life cycle.
Okay. Kind of a related question. Is there resistance when you use alternative nutrients to control coccidiosis? And do you recommend to rotate some of the nutrients that are non-antibiotic?
That's also a good question. And I don't think we know the answer to that definitively. Logic would say yes, right? Anytime we use a product that disrupts the life cycle of something, we're selecting for those organisms that are not affected. My experience has been, however, that like for saponins, for example, they're not so damaging to the cocci that we're significantly shifting that population. I've not seen resistance to saponins. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
Okay. See if I can find another one here real quick. Pavel is asking, can vaccines replace traditional coccidiostats in commercial production? And if we imagine that per 1 M2, the concentration of chickens is 23 to 26. I'm not sure I understand that. I know the first part.
Yeah, well, let's answer the first part. Absolutely, they can replace it. With several producers that have been using coccidiosis vaccine for several years in a row, especially in organic production. You don't have there's no choice of what else you can use, but there are plenty of producers that are using coccidiosis vaccines in an antibiotic free system. Absolutely.
All right, very well. Well, TJ, I think we're getting close to the top of the hour, so we're gonna call it quits for now. So I want to thank you. I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. If you have additional questions, please submit them to anh.marketing@balchem.com. The Real Science Lecture series of webinars continues on April 5th when we welcome an icon in the animal industry. Dr. Temple Grandin from Colorado State University will walk us through rethinking animal behavior and handling. Visit balchem.com/realscience for more details and to register. Balchem's podcast series continues to offer a deeper dive into our webinar topics. Log on to your favorite podcast platform and visit balchem.com/podcast. Subscribe to the Real Science Exchange and send us a screenshot along with your address and t-shirt size, and we'll send you a really cool Real Science Exchange t-shirt. On behalf of Balchem and Dr. Gaydos, thank you for joining us today.